All right, welcome to the Dixie Cryptid What If It's True podcast. I've got 5 stories in this video or podcast or whatever you want to call it. I liked every one of them. I thought all these stories were good, and I hope you enjoy them too. I am ready to get into it. All right, here we go. All right, here's an email from someone who doesn't have a name. I don't know. Maybe they have a name, but they didn't give it to me, which is not a problem. But this is a Bigfoot story, and he says this is absolutely true. In November of 1979, I was 14, not old enough to hunt legally in New York. My dad was an avid hunter who usually hunted in Naples. They call it part of the southern tier of the state. My dad worked with a man who owned some prime hunting property there. My uncle was supposed to go with him that year, but something came up, so my dad asked me if I'd like to go in his place and push the deer. Of course, I said yes. I was so excited I barely got any sleep the night before we left. We drove off at 4 a.m. and headed to the dark and frozen woods in our Ford Pinto wagon. Dad explained as we went what my function would be. I would head into the woods alone and push the deer to where he would be set up and ready for them. We got to the gravel road that took us into his coworker's property, and Dad told me to walk about 200 yards in the woods and hunker down for 45 minutes or so, and then start walking east. I actually knew a lot about the woods even then. I spent pretty much every spare moment of my time in the woods around our home. Well, anyway, Dad handed me his old 12-gauge shotgun. It was empty, but I had a couple of slugs in my coat pocket just in case. I stood there watching the tailgates of the Pinto disappear over the crest of the hill, and then turned and let my vision adjust to the darkness for a minute before I started walking. I wasn't afraid of the woods back then. I walked quite a ways, and I had to scale an old fence line at one point. I remember the patches of snow and how cold I was despite being dressed in 3 layers of clothes and a good pair of winter boots, the kind with liners that can be removed. It began to get light outside, but the sky was overcast in dark shades of angry gray. I went into a deep gully with 10 to 15 foot banks, and I followed it until it turned east, the direction I had to go to get to my father. Then I climbed the tall bank and found a good-sized tree that had fallen, and where I squatted and rested my back against it. By then I was tired. Without a good night's sleep, I'd been running on pure adrenaline all morning. I guess I nodded off. I woke up to the sound of a tree branch snapping, and I panned the area across the gully to the opposite ridge, thinking it might have been a big buck. And I searched across the area, and I saw what looked like a large man standing next to a tree. Well, I focused in, and I froze. It wasn't a man. My father was 6 feet tall, and this thing was nearly twice that. It was covered in hair, but it wasn't a bear either. I couldn't see its face. Its long, matted hair covered it, but I could see clouds of breath pouring through the hair on the cold morning air. Its hair was all brown, but a lighter shade on its chest and the front of its thighs. Based on its body position, it had to be looking straight at me. Well, I figured it was standing like this for 5 minutes or so, which felt like a lifetime to me. My heart was pounding out of my skin the whole time, but I was frozen in place and I couldn't move. And then it took one step in my direction, and that unfroze me. I turned and started running as fast as I could in the direction that I'd come. I had the 12-gauge, but I didn't think about it at the time. I approached the fence line, and I chucked the shotgun over it and dove over the fence behind it. And then I grabbed the gun and briefly looked back to see if anything was behind me, and I kept running until I got to the gravel road. During that Olympic run, I managed to lose a boot. I was only wearing the lining, but I didn't care. I got my bearings and headed up the road in the direction my dad had gone, and I found the Pinto parked on the side of the road, but to my horror, it was locked. There I was, surrounded by heavy woods in the middle of nowhere, and now painfully aware that monsters do exist. I loaded the gun and knelt down with my back against the car and waited and listened to every single noise. When my dad finally came out of the woods, he was asking, "What the hell happened to you, boy?" I told him exactly what happened. It was probably a bear, if anything at all, he reasoned. I told my best friend back then, and he seemed to believe me. I'm now 56 and I live in Florida. Dad has been gone since 1987, but I can relive that morning like flipping a switch. I did some small game hunting after that happened, but only in the woods where I grew up in Neverton. When I was in my 30s, I ran across the BFRO and reported the incident to them. A man contacted me about it, and we spoke for quite a while. The research I've done since then shows that these things migrate from the Adirondack Mountains down through the Herkimer Valley and into the southern tier as well as northern Pennsylvania and the Ohio Valley regions. Whoa! I did a story not too long, it was about 3 years ago, about a kid who was squirrel hunting and he ran up on the same thing. And it seems like his grandfather walked up behind him while he was facing this Bigfoot and just said, "You need to just back away. Come on with me and we're going to walk out. Everything's going to be fine." This story reminds me of that. I think people go in the woods, hunters. I've fallen asleep under trees before squirrel hunting, and I've fallen asleep in a deer stand before. You just get comfortable, especially if you're in a shooting house that's got a heater in it. Oh man. Get ready to take a nap. Take some food and be a glutton and then go back to sleep. But the minute you wake up, you look out that window, sometimes there'll be a deer standing there. And I can see that happening with Bigfoot. You fall asleep, you wake up, straight in front of you, there's this giant monster just staring at you, wondering what the hell you're doing there. Anyway, I love this story. I thought this was a great story. It was well written, and it had so much good stuff in it, so thank you to the writer. Okay, an anonymous writer, and this is about a Bigfoot, and he says this is true, absolutely true. I hail from the deep southern pines of Mississippi, where I grew up in the small community of Steep Hollow. After my parents separated when I was 10, my sister and I would spend weekends with our dad. He was living on his sister's land at the time. We enjoyed going there because my aunt's kids were around our age, which meant plenty of playmates. My oldest cousin and I were of an age to wield pellet rifles and had therefore deemed ourselves skilled hunters. Early one winter morning, we got up and dressed without waking anyone else and then headed out on a hunting excursion. We left my aunt's house at the top of the big hill and followed a gravel road down toward the family fish pond at the midway point. We passed the pond and kept going until the hill leveled out into a large field. On the other side of that field was a tree line where Crane Creek ran through the property, and beyond that my aunt's land continued for several more acres into the woods. We went into the tree line and followed the creek, plinking at old Coke cans and whatever little birds we thought we could hit, but we never did. We both noticed a rancid smell in the air. It was nauseating. It was a combination of rotting death and earth. Nevertheless, we carried on exploring and plinking. We were surrounded by the natural sounds of the woods. Birds were singing, and the creek gently babbled alongside of us as we explored. A short while later, we set up 2 pine cones for target practice, and I was taking aim when a bone-chilling, blood-curdling scream like nothing we had ever heard before split the air. Petrified, we froze in place. Growing up in the southern countryside, we knew the sounds of bobcats and wild hogs and pretty much every animal known to exist in those woods. But this one we couldn't identify. It was somewhere between a large cat and a woman screaming, but louder and angrier. It was almost as if it were raging at us. And from our best estimate, it was doing this from not more than 50 yards away on the other side of the creek, a distance that any predator big enough to make that sound would have no trouble closing in seconds. We didn't know what to do. and fear kept us frozen in place. Our eyes were like saucers as we stared at each other and then in the direction of the scream and then back at each other. I don't know exactly how long we stood there. It felt like several minutes. And then through the trees we saw my father's truck flying down the hill toward us with my aunt in the passenger seat. They were at the bottom of the hill in no time, but that was the part that felt like the longest to me. "Get in the truck," my dad yelled. We didn't have to be told twice. We jumped into the bed just as quick as he'd driven down the hill, and he drove us back up to the house. We didn't know it, but my dad and my aunt had been sitting on the front porch watching us that morning. We thought we'd slipped out of the house undetected. They were sitting there keeping a watchful eye on us when they heard that same scream that terrified us, but they saw something that we didn't. Shortly after the scream, they saw a monstrous black figure careening across the field in our direction. It was running on all fours and moving faster than anything they'd ever seen. Well, we never saw it, I assume because of the trees, but we smelled it and we absolutely heard it. It was a long time before we ventured off into the woods again, and to this day, I can still hear that scream. I'll likely never forget it. Oh, man. You ever miss a tragedy? Like, there was one time I remember when I was a kid, it was dark. We were all out playing at night. It was summertime, and you know, those kind of nights where as kids you could just go and go and go and go and run full speed and your energy never ran out. We were playing some game, I don't know, but I was running, it was one of the games where you're it, you try not to get caught. I can't remember the game, but I was running toward this magnolia tree. I was going to jump up in this magnolia tree. Of course, it was dark and I couldn't see anything. But I ran at that tree full speed, and I leaped. It's like I never slowed down. I leaped to get on, to grab onto the trunk and shimmy up the tree. Now, magnolia branches are down low, but these people had cut them off, and this thing had a trunk about head high to me. But I ran full speed at that trunk, and just as I bear-clawed that trunk and was fixing to shimmy up, there was a branch poking out of that magnolia tree, and it hit me right at the corner of my eye bone, the outside of my eye bone, and it deflected to the outside of my head toward my ear. It kind of went above my ear, but it put a pretty good cut in my eye. I mean, didn't need stitches or anything. But I was going so fast, if I had been an eighth of an inch closer to my right, that stick would have gone straight in my head and in my brain and killed me. It's one of those deals where you avoided a tragedy by micro inches, and you always remember it. And this is what this story reminds me of. It's like this thing was barreling through the field at them. I don't know how the parents got there fast enough before whatever this was, running on all fours, got to these boys. But man, you look back on things like that and you think, maybe God has a plan for my life or something, because he didn't kill me then, but he almost did. But that's what that reminded me of. And I don't know why I told you all that, but it's the first thing that popped in my head. And you know me, if it pops in my head, I'm going to say it. All right. Thank you to the writer for this story. It was really good. Really good. This email is from Dave, and Dave writes, in 1993, I bought an 8.5 acre property with a 4-bedroom home in Rice, Texas. It was originally part of the estate of a man named Clyde who died several years earlier. Neither his widow nor any of his children wanted the property. Almost immediately after moving in, strange things began to happen. One evening, I was standing at the sink washing dishes, and a butcher knife slid across the counter toward the sink from 8 feet away. Well, I jumped back and pulled my hands away just as the knife fell into the soapy water. There was no one in the kitchen but me. My son and daughter were in their rooms doing their homework, and my wife was watching TV in the living room. I went into the living room and asked my wife to come out to the kitchen. After I told her what happened, Neither of us could understand how the knife could have been propelled all that way down the counter into the sink, and it gave us both goosebumps. A few weeks later, my daughter was sitting at the dining room table and I was standing at the island in the kitchen when a measuring cup came flying out of the laundry room, and it flew across the room and hit the cabinets on the other side of the kitchen. Well, we were both startled. "What the crap is that?" my daughter yelled. Well, I walked over and picked up the cup. It was made of plastic, so it didn't shatter, but it did get a crack in it. No one was in the laundry room at that time. That incident also left us scratching our heads about what was going on in that house. The third event happened a couple of months later. My wife and daughter had gone into town to do some shopping, leaving my son and me at home. I had 250 rabbits under roof, and I was cleaning the barn and doing chores, checking the rabbits for sore hocks, checking the water flow in the cages and such. My son was cleaning out another barn on the other side of the property where our sheets and goats lived. I finished up before my son did, and I headed for the house to get a glass of iced tea. And I saw him still working at the other barn, so I went inside and took off my boots. That's essential when coming in from the barns. I fixed my tea and I sat down in my recliner in the living room. After 10 minutes, I heard the sound of boots walking across the kitchen toward the living room where I was sitting. Well, I hollered out that he needed to get those boots off in the house, but there was no reply. So I said it again, and still I got silence. The boots turned and headed down the hallway toward the bedroom, and I got out of the chair and walked to the hallway, but no one was there. I checked each bedroom and both bathrooms. There was no one. When I came back to the kitchen, I looked out through the window. My son was still out working in the barn. That was when I had had enough. So I yelled out, "Clyde, if that's you and you're the one doing these things, you need to stop. I know you love this house that you built, but you can see we're taking care of it just as you would have. So stop scaring my wife and kids. And I don't care if you want to hang around, but just watch and don't try to hurt anyone." For a long time, all the antics stopped, until one afternoon we had an insurance agent over. As we sat in the living room talking, my daughter mentioned something about our house ghost. The agent started mocking the existence of ghosts. All of a sudden, a glass candy dish full of candy was pushed off the coffee table, and it landed at the agent's feet. The guy's face turned every shade of pink and then bright red and back to white. He didn't say goodbye or thanks for letting me stop by. He didn't say anything. He picked up his briefcase and ran to the front door. He jumped in his car and took off like he had just gotten a green light on a drag strip. We couldn't stop ourselves from laughing, and I said, "Good job, Clyde." And after that, Clyde didn't make himself known much, but once in a while someone would feel his presence, but the antics stopped. "Oh, that's a great ghost story. He's like a friendly ghost. Clyde's like Casper, the friendly ghost in your house. He's probably just bumping into things, and he's probably a clumsy ghost." I love this story. It's a real nice, I like these feel-good stories every once in a while. They're great. Dave, thank you for sending this. I loved it. All right, the writer wants to be anonymous. It's about Bigfoot, and they're all true. They all claim they're true, and I don't doubt them a bit. My father passed away in 2004. He was a Vietnam veteran who wasn't scared of anything. But in the early 1970s, something happened that terrified him. It was a fall afternoon in the small town of Birdseye, Indiana. My father was squirrel hunting on my mother's family property. He used the opportunity to scout the land for signs of deer for the upcoming season. It was a nice autumn day, and Dad wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. He was enjoying being in the woods and surrounded by nature. As he made his way through the forest, he came across what he believed were some animal bones. He took a minute to look at them, but he wasn't all that interested, so he moved on. He hadn't gone much farther when he came across some more bones. And he moved on and he found more, and the deeper he moved into the woods, the more bones he came across. That was when he noticed a trail of bones leading up the hill. And all these remains lying around was odd, and Dad was the curious type. He decided to follow the trail of bones, and as he made his way up the hill, he noticed that the bones seemed to be getting bigger. Some of them almost looked human. Now, Dad was a medic in the Marines. He was familiar with human bones. And about halfway up the hill, he started smelling something pungent. If he was a medic in the Marines, he was a Navy corpsman, by the way. Just a heads up, my son was in the Marine Corps and I learned all this stuff. Back to the story. At the top of the hill, he found a cave, and all around it were more bones of all shapes and sizes. And when he approached the mouth of the cave, the odor got so strong it nearly overpowered him. The smell burned his eyes, and he fought back the need to vomit as he looked into the black opening. And a pair of red eyes stared back at him. He jumped backwards in shock at the glowing eyes that were easily 7 feet off the ground. An instinct kicked in, and he emptied both barrels of his shotgun into the mouth of the cave. But even as the shells were spent, he was turning and heading back down the hill at breakneck speed. He didn't wait to see if he'd hit anything or if he'd just made it angry. He got out of there. My father was never an animated man. He believed in getting right to the point. He kept a poker face at all times. But when he told this story, I could see the fear in his eyes and I could hear it in his voice. Years later, when I was 13, Dad and I were squirrel hunting on my uncle's place in Tazewell, Indiana. Like always, while we were there, we were scouting for deer trails and scrapes and rubs. It was a hot day in the middle of a dry spell, and Dad decided we'd follow a creek bed that wasn't more than a few water puddles here and there. And when we came around a bend in the creek, Dad stopped so quickly that I nearly ran into his back. I'll never forget the expression on his face when he turned around and looked at me. It was out of place for him. I really only remember having seen it when he spoke of that day at the cave. I was looking at my dad, and he was scared. "I don't know what the hell made this track," he said, "but we're not going to stick around to find out." I was born with my father's curious nature. I had to see what he was talking about. I thought maybe he was joking with me. And I looked around him, and at first I thought I was looking at some kind of deer track where the deer might have slipped or something, and then I realized next to the half-dried up puddle was a track that must have been 18 inches long and 9 inches wide. I could clearly see the toe prints in the mud. Well, Dad was right. We didn't need to stick around to see what had made that track. When we got back to my uncle's house, my dad told him what we'd found, and I guess I half expected my uncle to laugh at us. Instead, he looked at my dad straight in the eye and he said, "Well, this doesn't surprise me." My uncle had been hearing weird howls and noises for the past few weeks. He told us that he saw a hairy man who was over 7 feet tall take 2 of his pigs. And I guess we didn't have to wait around to find out what made the track. My uncle already knew. Oh man, the way you wrote this was perfect. Absolutely fantastic. And your dad was a Vietnam veteran and he wasn't scared of anything. Those guys had been through, a lot of stuff. And so everything else that they would run into after that was just, it was small peas compared to the horrors they had seen in war. And the same thing for the Afghanistan and Iraqi vets and all the other vets who've actually seen combat. But they run into a Bigfoot or something like a Bigfoot and it scares them to death. And I totally get that. I mean, I get it. Following all those bones up that mountain and then looking in a cave and 2 red eyes looking back at you. I don't think there's any doubt why those bones are there when you see that. And I would have shot into that cave too, but this was a great story and I appreciate it. It's a good little legacy to leave your dad. It's an interesting story that he shared with you and it'll be in a podcast for a long time. All right, brother. Thanks for the story. I don't know the writer's name. I've got his email address, but that doesn't matter because this is a good story. Let's jump into it. In 1979, my best friend and I flew to Texas to see the Royals play the Rangers in a 3-game series. We were juniors in high school at the time and big fans of the Royals. Typical of teenagers, we didn't get our reservations in time to fly down with the team, so we had to make separate accommodations. We still managed to get there without any trouble. It was a great weekend. We spent our days at Six Flags Over Texas amusement park, riding rides and enjoying our freedom the way kids on the verge of adulthood can, and in the evenings we went to the ball games. That was a great experience too. We watched the Royals take 2 out of 3 games. Everything was fine right up until we were ready to leave that Sunday evening, July 22nd. From that point forward, things went downhill. We were in a hurry to get to the airport, and I guess I must have left my return ticket on top of the cab. I didn't realize it until we got to the airport. I was lugging around 3 suitcases and a gym bag. I may have overpacked just a bit, and I had no place to go. My friend went ahead and got on our flight while I tried to reach my parents to tell them what happened. And right away, my parents contacted the airport to try to make arrangements to get me home. By now, it was pretty late, and Braniff Air had no more flights leaving for Kansas City that night, nor could they find any other flights to put me on, so I had no choice but to wait until early the next morning to fly out. I got the typical lecture from Dad. "Don't talk to strangers and do whatever the airport people say," he said. And then it was my mom's turn. "Now don't worry," she said. "I know a Christian Science woman there who has direct communications with God, and I'll ask her for help." "Okay, sure, Mom," I answered back, trying not to sound too sarcastic. Then I didn't give it another thought. By the time I hung up the phone and found a spot to sit with my bags all around me where I could watch out a big window at the planes taking off and landing, it was 10:45 p.m. I was watching a Boeing 727 taxi down the runway when it all started. Over my right shoulder, the room became very bright with an amber light, and I looked over to see a 9-foot-tall image of a very broad-shouldered being. At first, I thought it was a man, and then it began to speak to me telepathically. "Get up and follow me," it was saying. "I will get you home." The crazy thing was, I wasn't in the least bit afraid. I picked up my bags and I followed him. No one else was around except for an old man cleaning the floors a few feet away. The being led me to a gate and he pointed at the door. "Go on now, this is your way home," he said, still speaking telepathically. I entered the tunnel that led to an open door of an airliner. And inside the plane and to my left was the pilot and his associate doing their pre-flight checks. To my right were 2 stewardesses helping others, and I went to the open seat in the first row and I sat down with all my stuff in front of me on the floor. The stewardess came back and closed the door. Neither one ever looked at me or offered me anything after we took off. It was like I wasn't even there. Eventually, the pilot came over the intercom to announce that we would be landing in 90 minutes, and that was it. The plane landed without any issues. I got up to exit the plane, and the pilot came out of the cockpit, looked right at me, and said, "Well, I hope you enjoyed your flight. Don't worry, you have friends with you," and smiled. Well, I called my parents and let them know I had arrived and to have them come pick me up. Well, they were both surprised I was already home, but Dad more so than Mom. By the time Dad got to the airport, Dallas-Fort Worth was calling the house frantic that they couldn't find me. I tried to explain what I had experienced, but neither one of my parents believed me. They accused me of stowing away on another plane until they remembered there were no flights out that night. Oh, another great story. Oh man. I don't even know what to say about that. What a cool, strange experience, and I've never heard a story like this. I'm just speechless. I don't know what to say. And I'm not just saying that. I really don't know what to say. Why would it? None of it makes any sense, but it is so mesmerizing that this happened to this guy. And who would make a story like this up? It's so It's so non-eventful and very, there's no action to it. There's just a strange occurrence in this guy's life. Now, could it be all natural and people just didn't talk to him and they let him carry his luggage, his carry-on, and pack it all around him? That could be the truth, but it sounds more like this being he saw was really there and guided him on the plane and just got him home. I don't know. It's weird, but it's a great story. Thanks to the writer for sending it. If you like this video and you like these stories and you'd like to hear more of these, all you have to do is click the subscribe button and click the notification bell, and you'll get a notification for every one of these I put out. They're all pretty good. Now, I'm not a very good narrator, but the stories are great. If you want to hear more of them, do that. Follow the channel. Come back for another one. I would really appreciate it. Until next time, thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.